So this is one of my favorite books right now, How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. And one of my primary takeaways from this book is to learn about the specific brain parts and regions that work together to construct and maintain a continuous experience of self. And also that there are certain psychedelic substances out there that operate directly on those brain regions to turn down the volume and sometimes even entirely shut off that experience of the self. And so both ancient spiritual traditions and modern psychology point to this constructed self as the ultimate source of our suffering as human beings. And to be a little more specific, this self that the brain generates is made up mostly of this inner model that we have of who we are, identity, in other words. It's put together with like scraps of memory and words and images that are pieced together like the still frames of old movie film. And they're played across the screen of consciousness fast enough to give the illusion of continuity and of movement. But as we know, the map is not the territory. So if we take this inner model of self to be who and what we are, then we're confusing the map and the territory. And this self is also the sort of inner chatterbox that's running constant commentary on you and other people and the world. It's further discriminating between things, the good and the bad, the me and the not me, the like and the don't like, just further serves to separate the world into these categories. And oftentimes its commentary is pretty judgmental and negative towards everybody. And then also, this self is kind of obsessed with the past and the future. Attention gets funneled to the past to sort of source identity. That's where it gets the images to create identity from, and also to create the narrative of the self, the story. It's also obsessed with the future, and then like bridging past and future to try to get the future to be better than the past, and certainly to be better than the right now as well. And so when you put it all together, all of these self components, it creates the ongoing experience of being a separate, isolated fragment that is struggling to protect itself inside of a threatening world. And so whether or not we know what we're doing, we're all seeking ways to shut off the self. And there's all kinds of ways to do it. You can use dangerous adventure sports, tantric sex, psychedelic drugs, meditation, yoga, and more modern methods like neurofeedback or biofeedback. But whatever mechanism you use, the underlying knobs and levers in the nervous system and the body are exactly the same. And they get us to the same subjective experience too, which is ecstasis. And this is my other favorite book right now, Stealing Fire. And in this book, they talk about ecstasis, and this is really where I got the inspiration for this month's day-long tea group. And so in Stealing Fire, they point out that however you get to ecstasis, when you manage to jimmy the knobs and levers of the brain and body in just the right way, it leads to the same qualitative, subjective experience. Ecstasis is marked by 4 qualities: selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness, and richness. And so selflessness, we've kind of already talked about it. This is what happens when the brain regions that are responsible for creating the sense of self, when they quiet way down, so does that neurotic inner voice, which is a relief, to say the least. And so what also gets turned down is that experience of being separate, isolated, and under threat. That starts to dissolve too. And when that does, we start to realize, we start to be able to see the inherent underlying oneness or unity that all apparently separate forms, even though they are in separate bodies and separate beings and whatever, they actually come from the same source. And so the timelessness piece, the second quality of ecstasis, is, well, when we're in our ordinary state of consciousness and the self is obsessed with the past and the future, that attention is almost always in the past, it's almost always in the future, we wind up viewing the present through a very narrow window. And it looks like there isn't really all that much there. But when the self shuts off, so does the obsession with the past and the future. The past and the future just dissolve because they aren't real. They're memories. They're also constructions inside the head, right? So when those begin to dissolve, this present moment begins to dilate. Yeah? The narrow window gets a lot bigger. And it starts to reveal richness, the third quality of ecstasis. And this is like going from black and white to color, from 2 dimensions to 3, from standard to high definition. It's like full stereo surround sound reality. And it has this quality of incredible richness and detailedness and like aliveness. And we see that there is so much more to the present moment that we can engage with, that it's actually like a flowing river that we can join with and be carried by. And this gives rise to the experience of effortlessness, the fourth quality of ecstasis. So once we've stepped through that narrow window and discovered the magical wonderland of the present moment, once we've noticed that it has an unfolding life of its own, we can join with that flow. And it's what we experience whenever we're like deeply absorbed in one of our projects, that we're being carried and propelled by a force that's larger than ourselves, that we're participating in something that is larger and carrying. That's the experience of effortlessness. So no wonder that we invest so incredibly much into getting ourselves into states of ecstasis. And the authors of Stealing Fire, when they sort of calculated all the different methods and means of getting there, they estimate that globally we spend upwards of $4 trillion on getting to ecstasis. And so people often describe ecstasis as a peak experience, something that's worth about $4 trillion, because it reveals the true nature of ourselves and the world that we live in. And it feels like an awakening because it is. It's an awakening from the dream of the inaccurate self. We're waking up from the constructed self, which is just a map of, just a symbol or a representation of the true self, which is your being, your presence, your alive existence here in this world, which is deeply and profoundly interconnected with all that is around you. And this is what the spiritual traditions of all time have been talking about. And so there are a bunch of different routes to individual ecstasis. That's what I've talked about so far. But there are also pathways to collective ecstasis. And this is what's at play at those trancy dancy concerts and at political rallies, at Burning Man and all festivals, and also high-performing groups like professional sports teams or the Navy SEALs. The experience, it's also called group flow, has the same capacity to turn down the volume on the self and bring us into the selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness, and richness of ecstasis. But it has this additional quality where that sense of the separate I, that quiets down, obviously, it has that same effect. But what also begins to arise in the experience of group flow is the sense of the collective we. It becomes more obvious that though we have separate bodies, and that is also like a true thing, it's paradoxically also true that we are one thing, right? So collective ecstasis includes more of that experience. And so T group is already designed to do this, to bring us into states of group flow. But anyone who's done even a little bit of T group knows that it's really hit or miss when it comes to ecstasis. And so this poses a pretty fascinating question then. What are the factors that make it more likely for us to squeeze through that narrow window together? And what are the factors that stand in the way? And so this is what I'll be sharing more about at Saturday's day-long T group intensive. And in addition to our regular T group practice, we'll be weaving in other elements that I think will allow us to more easily find that narrow path and also investigate the obstacles that arise along the way. And so why is all of this important? Aside from being fun and interesting, what does this ultimately mean? Well, ecstasis it's not only inherently pleasurable, it's also healing and revelatory. It wakes us up from the dream of the separate suffering self, and it reveals the underlying holiness if you don't mind me saying, the underlying sacredness of our being and the world that we live in. It reveals that there's actually something ancient within you, that your consciousness is just a piece of something that has been here since the beginning of time. Yeah, that's kind of cool. And it shows us that this is perhaps what I think is really the core of it. It reveals how we are so much more similar than we are different. And the perception, the illusion of us and them, good and bad, in and out, this is the underlying belief system that lets wars happen and that is perpetuating conflict among us. And I think it's important that we wrap our heads around how none of that is ultimately true. All right, that's enough. I hope you can join us for the day-long Tea Group Intensive on Saturday. And if not, Ecstasis is, like I said, built in to Tea Group practice all by itself. So if you can't make it to the day-long, then I hope you can join us for one of the Sunday night gatherings or any of the other bunch of stuff we do. Bye.